our first conversation for this morning. As we said earlier, it is a continuation of a discussion that we started yesterday. This time, we're joined by the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, Keith Gilges, and he's here to talk to us about a number of topics, but starting off, of course, with the U.S. perspective on what's happening in Venezuela. Good morning, and thank you for being here.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me on. I think it's been about 2 months, 3 months since I was last on.
Yeah.
And I know at the time I promised that I would make an effort to come back frequently to get to see you in the morning, so it's great to be back already. I can't believe it's already February.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that I've already been in Belize for 6 months.
Yeah.
You know,
Just admit it, you missed us.
It has gone by incredibly quickly, and I'm sure my entire 3-year tour here will go by very quickly. But again, thank you very much for having me on this morning.
Yeah.
You know, I want to touch a little bit on what you were talking about earlier, and just on behalf of the U.S. mission and the U.S. people, let me pass my condolences on to the Cummings and Yanai families for the tragedy they faced. And it really does impact the entire community. When this sort of violence happens, it is senseless, and it is tragic. And so, just for those families, I just want to make sure that we pass on our condolences as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. But I want to get into the meat of the conversation of today. It has been just about 4 weeks since there has been a major shift in Venezuela, with Juan Guaido declaring himself as the interim president. There has been continuous focus on specifically the U.S. relation with Venezuela and some of the declarations coming out there. I just want to give you the opportunity as we start to give me what is the U.S. perspective on this issue at this time.
Sure. You know, it is easy and facile to try and explain this as a U.S.-Venezuela issue. It is not. It is a Venezuela issue. And this is an issue that is impacting the people of Venezuela. What the international community did, starting on January 23rd, was recognize what is going on within Venezuela. So the fact that the election that occurred back in May was a sham. When you jail opposition leaders, when you shutter the free press, when you don't have a judicial system that functions as it's supposed to protect the people, you end up with an election that does not express the will of the people. That election was a sham. The inauguration that followed that then has no more legitimacy. So what Juan Guaido did when he declared himself interim president under Venezuela's constitution, Articles 333 and Articles 350, said that they do not have a functioning presidency.
If there's a vote of no confidence.
He has the unanimous support of the only legitimately democratically elected institution that remains in Venezuela, which is the National Assembly. And he has their support. So the fact that he then named himself interim president, what the international community has done, and it's over 51 countries now, and that includes the United States, is simply recognize that he is expressing the will of the people as democratically elected, and he is pushing as interim president towards a process that has free and fair elections. That requires a new electoral commission that is not under the thumb of the Maduro regime. That requires a free press, and that requires a legitimate a justice system that's not, again, under the thumb of this dictator.
Now, Keith, I hear what you're saying, and I hear you specifically saying the international community, but it's very difficult for those who are looking at the situation to extricate the U.S. from this particular scenario because of, if I was to put it simply, just the strained relationship that has existed between Venezuela and the United States for many years. But even more so, one of the things that came to light following the declaration that Juan Guaido made was that the United States Vice President Mike Pence had spoken to Guaido the day before he declared himself. That gives many different perspectives in who perhaps orchestrated, who perhaps influenced Juan Guaido deciding to declare himself interim president.
It is Guaido who declared himself interim president. Now, when you look at what has happened over Venezuela for the past number of years, at least the past 6 years, it is both a travesty, a tragedy, and a crime. It's a travesty because this should be one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. It has unbelievable oil resources, but for so many years, the government has not put any money back into PDVSA. That should be the jewel in the crown of Venezuela. It is the primary financial earner for Venezuela. And when this government said we're not going to put any money and reinvest in that, if you own a house, you have to keep up, you have to maintain it. If you have a car, you have to put money into it to keep it running. Number two,
I want to just get a direct answer to the question. If people were to look at this situation and see the conversations that took place before Juan Guaido declared himself interim president and the specific connections with the United States that some see as an influence, some media outlets have even said that perhaps you are leading or orchestrating the coup that is taking place in Venezuela.
Well, I would disagree with
and there is confirmation, even from the White House, that Vice President Mike Pence did contact Guaido before he declared himself.
For us to have conversations with world leaders is not anything new. For you to characterize what is happening in Venezuela as you characterized it is entirely inaccurate. It is the will of the people that is being expressed through, as I said, the only democratically elected institution that remains. That is what Guaido is representing. Conversations happened with Mike Pence. I'd refer you to the White House on those, but if Vice President spoke with him, I don't see any problem with that. But when you have then Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, most of Central America, Canada, most of the EU, all these countries are recognizing Guaido as the only legitimate and interim leader of Venezuela, I think that speaks volumes.
No, the problem, in terms of monitoring the conversation, and maybe I should start off with the money aspect of it, that the argument from the current Venezuelan president is that what is happening to me is that the world powers, including the leader, the Americans, they have crushed us economically. We have money, $1 billion in this account in the UK, 500 million in this account. And so what they have done is that they have created a situation where I can't service my people. It's not that I don't want to, it's that I have so much oil that the greed of the world powers has been punishing me to create a scenario where I can't perform, and then to say, you can't perform now, you need to be overthrown.
The economic policies of the Maduro administration and late in the Chavez administration are solely responsible for the economic destruction that has occurred in Venezuela, period. For them to attempt to blame that on anybody else is ridiculous. They have not invested their money. What we have done is said, we're not going to let this government continue to loot the resources that belong to the people of Venezuela to enrich themselves. So yes, those accounts that they have offshore were not to benefit the people of Venezuela. They were to benefit Maduro and his cronies. That we're not allowing anymore. And so we are cracking down, and we're saying that level of corruption is unacceptable. Those are being held in reserve for the Venezuelan people. And at the same time, we're offering up over $140 million that we've spent recently to deal with the exodus of, I think it's up to 3.6 million people who have fled Venezuela because they don't have food and they don't have medicine. We've offered up $20 million in humanitarian aid for the people of Venezuela, which this government is not allowing.
The response from the Maduro government is, we don't need your 20 million. We have 4 billion out there.
Well, and now more when you pile a bunch of gold on a plane and fly it out of the country. Is that for the benefit of the Venezuelan people? I don't think so. They have had 20 years to try and resolve the inequities that existed in Venezuela, and they have driven that economy into the ground. You can't argue that sanctions that we put on a month ago are responsible for the destruction of a company like PDVSA that is now producing a third of the oil that it was producing 20 years ago. This is wholly and solely upon the head of this regime that this economy has gone into freefall.
I find the need to separate two issues, because it is what is happening or what has been happening in Venezuela is real. You know, you hear from the people, you hear of the humanitarian crisis. There's a shortage of food, medicine, fuel, many things that have been inaccessible for a long time. But then there's also the declaration of Juan Guaido as an interim president, what's been unfolding over the past 4 weeks. And why it's necessary to separate these issues is because the question here is the motive as to why this unelected,
He is absolutely elected. He was elected in a democratic process that expressed the will of the Venezuelan people. Who was not elected
he was not
is
elected
Maduro.
by the people of Venezuela,
It's not a popular
by
vote.
the registered voters. He did not participate in the election.
He did not participate in the last sham presidential election, correct? But he is the official representative of the only elected body that remains in Venezuela, which is the National Assembly.
Now, the reason I want to separate these issues, because what I want to tackle is there was and there is a humanitarian crisis taking place in Venezuela.
Absolutely.
Why was the support of an interim leader seen as the best possible way to help the people in the country? Because what we have seen since then is really a worsening of the situation because of the power struggle that is now taking place.
Yep. The answer to that question is hope.
Hope for?
Hope for a better future. And there is no path that this current regime in Venezuela was going down that provided hope for Venezuela's future. Guaido offers that hope. It is an opportunity to say, put in a new electoral commission, have new elections that are free and fair, and let the will of the Venezuelan people speak. That is not what is happening when you have Maduro in power. He rigged the election, he jailed the opposition, he does not have a free press. In those situations, how can we say that this is the future? What Guaido offers is hope. It is a pathway towards a better future. Venezuela should and will become a wealthy, equitable society again,
But
but
it is
not
driven
under
the
this
country
administration.
to what people are seeing as the brink of a civil war. How does this help the people? How does this
This
offer
administration of Nicolas Maduro has driven the country to this point. Let's be very clear about that. What we're saying is that we cannot continue as an international community to just sit back and watch him destroy his own country. This is an alternative. This is a way forward. It is temporary, it is an interim presidency, but allows a path forward for Venezuela.
Perhaps it's one of the questions that has to be asked, because you say this is the way forward, as in the only way forward. But there are other countries that have gotten together in Montevideo to try to work out a peaceful resolution, to encourage dialogue, to be able to solve this problem, rather than taking sides.
Everybody wants a peaceful resolution to this problem. There's no question about that. Nobody supports violence. Having said that, continuing the sort of dialogue that Nicolas Maduro seeks is one in which he simply retains in power, he dilutes the messaging, he tries to just hang on to power because that's all that is motivating him anymore, is a desire for power.
6 million people, I heard that number, and please correct me anytime I'm wrong. 6 million people voted in this last election. You classify it as a sham, but it is a legal process. I remember in Belize, we just had an elections where the opposition challenged election petition several of the seats, and if that had won, then there would have been a change in government. I liken it to a situation like that where you would have, for example, another superpower, England, to make it more palatable, coming in and saying, we don't think that the UDP government that this was a fair election. This election petition should have won. And even though the courts ruled contrary, we kind of side with the opposition. And so we now recognize them as the government. Now, that's not my question, but that's just the way I put it in the context of me being able to appreciate it. It's external powers making comments on local and municipal elections. But I look at the history of the US in terms of its geopolitics, and we have to accept it for what it is. The backyard policy is one that neighborhood policy. That this is our backyard and this is our neighborhood, and we're going to make sure that over here is good, which is a good thing in certain regards. But we look at the history of the US in Grenada, for example. We look at the history of the U.S.
1984.
Correct. Its involvement in Jamaica when you had the Manley government and their experiment in social democracy. We have the Cuba relations. We have the Guatemala experience. We have the Panamanian experience. All of these are surely an exercise of the U.S.'s policing, so to speak, of this hemisphere. I don't see why it is wrong for the U.S. to say, listen, we are exerting a bit of political influence here. Whether or not...
We are exerting a bit of political influence here.
And then
we are absolutely calling on the international
Okay.
community
Okay.
to recognize Guaidó.
And so, if I could just finish the point. And so, it is also then open to the rest of the world. Because another part of I was watching the show yesterday, where we had the Venezuelan ambassador. And he was saying, listen, it's really the US pushing this. And they've gotten their friends to join on. But we have 75%, I can't remember what the figure was, of the world leaders, including Belize, and that's where I want to land, who are saying, pump brakes a little. This gentleman who has declared himself, and even that is a bit paradoxical, to be president, needs to be dealt with in a different way. No. So how do you address the issue of Belize?
His facts that he presented yesterday
were
as accurate as most of the facts coming out of the Maduro administration, which leaves them very open to question. It is not 75% have come out in support.
Which we corrected during the show. It is only about 40 nations that have supported Guaido.
51.
And
it is now
it's
51.
not 75% of the nations that have supported Maduro. Some have, a few, and the rest have worked towards the peaceful resolution, as I spoke, or have taken no position.
That's accurate. Going back to your earlier comment about how the process and the elections worked here in Belize, that was actually terrific to see. And yes, as an international diplomat here, as an American diplomat here, I do pay attention to what happens. There was an election, there was a contest, it went to the court decided, and everybody said, okay, we trust the system, and it stayed, according to the local rules. That's great. If Belize wants to teach Venezuela how to properly run an election and have a free and fair democratic system, I'm 100% supportive of that. I absolutely believe in the stable accuracy of elections that occur here in Belize. It's a great system. It also shows how power shifts for a little while. It is natural for any government, after it's been in power for a while, for people to say they want to change. There has not been a change in Venezuela since Chavez was elected, because there's been no opportunity after the first election for there to be a real reflection of the will of the Venezuelan people. And when you have the administration of Nicolas Maduro that's been in power since 2013, that its main goal is to stay in power. What's the goal of any first-term president is to have a second term, and in this case, just to continue on for as long as possible. So is there a role for the international community to speak out on these things? Absolutely. Aren't we supposed to be doing that? When there is injustice, aren't we supposed to speak out? When there's a tragedy, aren't we supposed to speak out? When neighbors of Venezuela are reeling under the impact of 3.6 million refugees, can't we also provide support to those countries? And
yes.
We have over $140 million in
yes.
humanitarian aid.
Yes, but I think the criticism is that you can't create the situation and then speak on it. It can't be that you don't feed somebody for 20 days and say, how do you have gastroenteritis?
The international community did not create the crisis in Venezuela. And for them to push blame on somebody else is
what I wanted to ask, was let's look at, there's money, it's about money, and money. It's all about the money.
It's about justice, fairness, and hope for the future.
Yes. But in practical terms, it's really about the economics. That's really what it boils down to. And Venezuela represents an economic threat. You're talking about one of the largest oil reserves in the world. This is
Who does Venezuela represent an economic threat to?
Well, to look at the foreign policy of Venezuela in terms of helping in Petrocaribe in the Caribbean neighbors.
Listen, that's a great example. Petrocaribe, as a result of that, there are countries like Belize that got some fantastic benefits from that.
Yes.
Undeniably.
Yes.
That was an effort that the Chavez government had when it was producing a lot of oil. When oil prices were high, to spread that largesse around the community. Don't deny that that benefited Belize. Though that was a gift of the people of Venezuela. Continuing to support the regime that currently exists is not benefiting the people of Venezuela. And the future of Venezuela is not with Maduro. The way a country like Belize says thank you to the people of Venezuela for the gifts that it received through Petrocaribe years ago is to support the best hope for the future of Venezuela.
So do you disagree with the position of, I was watching our Deputy Prime Minister sort of walk back the position, I think it was the OAS, that the Belize had very condemning remarks on the Maduro government, and then it appears that our Deputy Prime Minister...
It was the head of the OAS,
yes,
yeah.
the Deputy Prime Minister walked it back. So it appears from where we are officially that Belize is not on the same page with America and the coalition of
What Ambassador
supporters.
Gutierrez said in his remarks at the OAS was that it is the responsibility of any state to look after its people. Yeah. And in this, the Venezuelan government has, and I quote, unquestionably failed. I agree with Ambassador Gutierrez. I agree with his assessment of how the Venezuelan government has failed.
He's an employee, though. The boss says he kind of spoke out a turn.
I have no doubt that that Ambassador Gutierrez made those remarks, prepared, not extemporaneously, with the full support of this government. Yeah. I have no doubt about that.
And I think that would be a fair judgment. But Keith, this is precisely why I wanted to separate this as two issues, because I don't think there can be any doubt as to the suffering of the Venezuelan people. I don't think any person around the world who's paid attention to what was happening there can say that life has been good in Venezuela. Yeah. The issue, though, and much like Ambassador Gutierrez did at that time, was acknowledging what was wrong, what was taking place there, and the suffering of the people. But he did not support Guaido. He did not outwardly support an unelected official rising up and saying, I am now the interim president of a country. But I want to go a step further. One of the things that you pointed out, and this is very crucial to us with all the conversations we're having right now, Belize relies on international support. We rely on the international community we have all the stories of the hallway discussions and leading up to our independence, to getting assistance and building allies in getting to this point of our Belize-Guatemala dispute. We understand that many times you have to rely on international friends to be on your side. But international support does not equate to intervention. And that's the latest messaging we have coming out of the United States, that there is the potential that the United States will intervene in Venezuela. And I want to ask you very straightforward, what is the likelihood of this happening?
I would refer you to the statements that have been made by the White House on this. I'm not going to get it into conjecture. I can't speculate. I can't tell you that the future probability is X. I'm just not in a position to do that.
But you do know
what
the position.
We're doing is supporting.
You do know the position of your government, which for the past few weeks, the message has been the same, that if necessary, the United States will intervene in the crisis in Venezuela.
I don't believe that is an accurate reflection of what the administration has said.
Then you can tell me how it has been precisely worded.
In dealing with any situation, you have options on the table that you consider.
Yes.
They are going to range from the fringe to the more likely. I am not sitting at that table back in Washington. What has been said is that we're considering options on the table.
Including intervention.
Yes, and President Trump himself said twice that surely all options on the table, including
all options are on the table.
Military action.
He has said that in the past.
Yes.
And I think perhaps that is the more jarring scenario for people. The idea of another country in this day and age intervening, especially within this hemisphere, I should say, because I know the Middle East experience is a lot different, but especially within this hemisphere. it's one of the scenarios that I think that people look at and question what the motives are here.
And what would you say the motives are there?
Well, that's why I ask you the question. What is the official position on the U.S. intervening in Venezuela?
We are not intervening in Venezuela. We are supporting a process that provides a future hope for the people of Venezuela. We are supporting an interim president who, based on the Constitution, is looking towards having free and fair elections. So where we can come out and say, we are supporting, we recognize Guaido, that is our goal here. But again, to pitch this, as you have a bit there, as a US versus Venezuela issue is not accurate. This is an issue about the people of Venezuela and their future. And it was not the US that said to Guaido, do this. It is Guaido that did that. We recognized it. And so we are simply, along with the international community, saying that this is what we believe to be the best future for Venezuela.
I'll ask you the very same question that I asked the ambassador yesterday, and using the very same phrase. When the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. The situation in Venezuela has not improved in the past four weeks. We've seen the stories. If anything, there are more people fleeing. The shortages are worse.
And next month, it is likely to be worse than this month if there's not a change in Venezuela. And Maduro has to go, period. He is not part of Venezuela's future. But to argue that because we declared sanctions on PDVSA, that's the reason that it's worse today than it was a month ago, it takes a lot longer for those things to take effect. The money that through Citgo and other companies is no longer being funneled into Maduro's hands. It is being held for the future of the Venezuelan people. But the situation is worse now than it was a month ago. It is worse than it was 3 months ago. It is worse than it was 6 months ago. The trend line in Venezuela has been this. It has been down for
But
too
can
long.
I ask this? What allows the international community, which most people will see as the US, what allows the international community to hold money which belongs to somebody else?
Because what they are doing with that is criminal. And the corruption that exists within the Maduro government says, no, you cannot use our financial system to siphon off the patrimony of the Venezuelan people for your own gain.
Keith, let me understand this properly. So the money that's being held is not money laundering. It's not money which is illegal. It is, I have oil, I sold oil to you, I need back my money from that I sold you, and then an intermediary comes in and says, you're not going to pay Keith. I'm going to hold your money because Keith is a drug addict and I'm not giving him the money at all, without any legal process to allow for that.
We have put sanctions so that that money no longer goes towards a corrupt regime.
Sanctions, as I understand it, for example, in Cuba, are I have things that I could give you, and so, or you need to pass your money through me. And so I am not going to give you the things that I can give you. Mm-hmm. But in this case, my concern and my question is, how can you keep my money? It's my money. What I thought could happen is that there's a legal way.
It is the Venezuelan people's money, and we are releasing it to the Guaido government for his use. He is appointing a new board of directors for Citgo. So it is the Venezuelan. What we're not doing is letting Maduro and his cronies siphon off this money and move it offshore. This money is not going. It was not going to the Venezuelan people.
The judgment call as to who, and we've seen it in Belize, where leaders have said, even though this is the legally, and whatever you feel about the background of that election, the legally elected person, we're not going to deal with this person, we're going to deal with person X. The way that the Belizean people or the American people express themselves is through their leadership. So the way the US express themselves is through Donald Trump. The way Belize expresses themselves is through our Prime Minister, Nadine Barrow. They were elected. Whatever we feel about the elections, maybe we prefer to be another way. But I want to ask a question and I want to make a statement. And so I'll choose the question. Isn't there another way to have allowed the money to go through and legally challenge the government? Whether or not it's by supporting another candidate through the elections, or is it that just the US and the international leaders lost in the last elections? Because the margins were pretty close. If you have a dictator and he's still only winning by what, about 10 percentage points? And that's a very weak leader. Or you have a democratic system.
So I gotta take a little time to unpack that. There were a number of different things in there. Listen, ultimately, what we're looking at is, you sort of made a statement. Which one of those would you like me to try and?
My apologies. There's just a lot that we want to get in a very short period of time, and so sometimes I get a bit excited.
Sure.
But you can handle it.
It is, the elected leaders of the United States. Yes, Donald Trump was elected president. He is our leader.
Yes.
Dean Barrow is the elected leader of Belize.
Absolutely.
I do not, and we do not believe that Maduro is the properly elected leader of Venezuela. So he's not in the same category. When we put sanctions on, and we had a number of different sanctions on Venezuela for a long time, it was specific to the leadership that said, you cannot use the US financial system to siphon money out of Venezuela and park it in Florida. We're saying, we're turning off that tap for you. You can't use it anymore. Those sanctions went in place. The sanctions that we recently announced were on PDVSA, saying, okay, that company and its employees can no longer operate using the US system. If there is money out there, we're going to hold on to that money until we can ensure that it goes towards the people of Venezuela. That's just, that's fair, and that promises a better future for the people of Venezuela.
What is the end goal here?
That we have a hemisphere of freedom, that it is a bastion of democracy, that the will of the people is expressed, and that means that governments change. That means that new leaders come in. That means that parties shift, as we've seen in any place, as in Belize. That is what we're looking for. And when you see a government that repeatedly has failed its people, and I'm quoting the Belizean ambassador when he says this government has unquestionably failed its people, then we don't sit idly by. We say there is an interim president who, under the Constitution of Belize, has said he wants to move towards free and fair elections. And we simply recognized him, along with the vast majority of countries in this hemisphere and in Europe. Not Russia, not China, not Turkey.
If I were to imagine myself as a person living in Venezuela suffering, praying I don't get sick, so, because I won't be able to access medicine, and all the other issues that an average Venezuelan is facing. And I see a power struggle taking place within my country. I know, based on my experience, that elections elect a leader. I didn't like how the elections were conducted. Like most countries, I think. People don't like how elections are conducted. And I see another person step up, say they're president, interim president, and all these outside forces have supported him. And I try to understand how this is going to play out for me, my children, my family, because there is a system already established within the country itself. And this is kind of where I want to get your response. One of the clear issues here is the right to self-determination.
I agree 100%. We are in complete agreement on that.
Which is why I have asked multiple times, could there not have been another way of trying to get the injustices that you have called out many times here that have been cast upon the Maduro government, President Maduro?
Yeah.
Could there not have been another way, rather than leaving the Venezuelan people in a very difficult predicament?
Yeah.
The military, let's give that example. The military is a function of the government. There's now a message coming out from Guaido saying, if you revolt, essentially, that's my word, we'll support you. You'll be fine once I take over power. Imagine the decision of that person in the military at that time, if he has a family.
So you went back and you asked a question about the election. What should have happened? How about a free and fair election in Venezuela? And so you keep saying, well, this elected leader, that was not a free and fair election. Nobody in the international community said that that represented the will of the people. It was rigged, opposition leaders were jailed, the free press was muzzled, all those things happened. And yes, then Maduro was elected. That does not make him a legitimate leader.
Let me raise this, because I can't sit here and when I leave, my friends say, Kevin, why did you ask the Charge d'Affaires that question? The US is not necessarily completely absolved from criticism internationally about its own elections. The Bush election, you remember, had its own controversy in Florida.
Democracy is messy.
Yes, I'm just
Democracy is tough.
I'm just giving you examples. So we had the Bush election where the Supreme Court and the
recounting
and
hanging
all these
chads in
questions
Florida. I remember that well.
Was its own mess. And then we
There's
had
even investigations now on
and that's where I'm going. And then we have the question now of where your elected president, there were issues as to him and his relationship with Russia, who now are at bucking heads, and questions as to the legitimacy of this current president of the United States. What if the world community, the world leaders, and this is why the perception is that the world leaders is really America. What if the world leaders somehow said, we don't think Trump is president? You know, because under their elections, you can't have this tampering and, you know, the Supreme Court appointments in terms of, my question is, all countries, as you say, have problems with democracy. And so it ought not to be, do you agree, that somebody who has external power exerts that power to then determine externally, outside of the processes,
Listen,
what it is.
democracies are tricky. Elections are hard to run. They're only done every few years, and then it's this massive effort countrywide in whatever country. Democracy is tough.
Very.
So you need institutions that say, hang on, are we doing an appropriate reflection of the will of the people? And if not, those institutions step in. There are election monitors all over the world in a lot of elections. International monitors come in. There will be international monitors looking at the referendum that's coming up at the invitation of the Belizean government. Did the Venezuelan government say, we welcome election monitors? No, they forbid them because they knew that it was going to be a fraudulent election. They knew that it was going to be rigged. And so, yes, am I declaring that our democracy functions perfectly? No. These are processes that are managed at the county level. They're different all over. So yes, hey, there can be questions about it. We have strong institutions to look into that. You can't doubt that. Any question there's not a free press in the United States? Is there any question that there's not a special counsel with powers to investigate the president? All that is going on. Is that happening in Venezuela? No. That's a fraudulent democracy.
Now, let's come back to present day, and I hear what you're saying in the election that was carried out in Venezuela and why that leads to the recognition for the United States of Juan Guaido. In this present day, there's been, I asked the ambassador yesterday, I've been following the news as to whether or not Maduro is even contemplating stepping down. And the answer seems to be no. A consistent no. So again, I go back to how far is the commitment to prolong this without looking at other alternatives?
The word out of the Maduro regime is going to be no up until the day he's gone. So that's not going to change. But the fact remains, he is not the future of Venezuela. And the future of Venezuela is going to be decided by the people of Venezuela, whether it's through a peaceful protest on the street saying we simply do not agree that this illegitimate government should stay, and increasing recognition of Guaido. That, to me, is the future. And again, let's keep the focus. It's on Venezuela.
Of course.
People like to point at us, point at the US about it. But again, look at the hemisphere. Have you talked to the Brazilian ambassador? Have you talked to the Colombian ambassador? Have you talked to the Chilean, Argentina, most of Central America? I mean, ultimately, we all want to see a better future for the people of Venezuela who are suffering. We have $20 million in aid sitting on the border waiting to roll in. Food, medicines, hygiene kits, all those things for the people of Venezuela. Open the border, let that roll in.
Can I bring it back a little to home too?
Sure.
The US has imposed sanctions on Venezuela, particularly against PDVSA.
Recently against PDVSA,
Recently.
all the original sanctions
Right.
were against the,
Right.
the
I want to
the
focus
crop
on the
leaders.
sanctions against PDVSA. Don't those sanctions directly affect Belize?
No, not at all. Not a single thing here, and I've confirmed this.
Isn't the Belizean government, along with PDVSA, joined together in a company called Appbell, I believe it's?
It exists with, I believe, a receptionist sitting at a desk doing nothing.
But
That is all that remains. It's a shell.
it's a shell, but it does
Belize
exist.
has not imported oil from Venezuela for over a year. The sanctions that have rolled out will have zero impact on Belize. The oil that and gas that Belize is importing are from other sources. So Appbell, which existed during Petrocrude is
Safe.
exists in name only, and I believe you will hear probably pretty soon that it's shut down entirely, because I'm not sure who's paying the receptionist to sit out front. But she has nothing to do. It's a shell.
So I want to give you the opportunity as we close off, because you keep on saying it, and I do agree with you. The purpose of this conversation over the past 2 days is to really shed light as to what our brothers and sisters from Latin America are experiencing, and the questions of influence are necessary, but also we need to bring it back to them. What is your hope, and what is the plan? I know Brazil has offered to hold the current aid that is trying to go in and try to dispense it into Venezuela. What is the plan at this point forward, so that while this struggle, this power struggle continues, that the people don't suffer more?
Open up and allow the humanitarian aid in. $20 million worth of aid sitting at the border. We have more aid sitting in warehouses in Miami and Texas. Mr. Maduro, open up that border and let that aid in.
Can I
That's
just say,
the
though,
message.
that's, I mean, I think any random person can assume that will fall on deaf ears. Perhaps the last person President Maduro wants to hear advice from is the United States, or someone recognizing another leader, let's say it that way. So saying to him, open up the borders is one thing. What are other options on the table?
I ask Belize to reach out to the Venezuelan, the current regime in Venezuela, and say, open up your borders, allow the aid in.
Can I ask my final question? The call has been for us to focus on the Venezuelan people suffering. But what if I were to ask you to address the issue of my personal view, which is we shouldn't focus on the suffering of the Venezuelan people. We should focus on why they're suffering, and we should focus on the why of why there are sanctions against them. And we should focus on why it is that the Maduro government is there, and we should focus on why Guaido is there. Because the whats are not as important, because you can get tricked. You can, if you just look at this cup, you can get tricked by everything else that's around. But can you at least assure us that the whys are lined up properly? That we're not just being asked to focus on the suffering of the Venezuelan people, but that the why we should focus on it, and the factors which bear to why they're suffering are the ones which you are saying we should focus on.
I will quote Belizean Ambassador Daniel Gutierrez again. It is the responsibility of the state to take care of its people, and in this, the government in Venezuela has unquestionably failed.
All right. Thank you for coming in and having this conversation with us.
Thank you very much for having me here. And like I said, it will be a continuing conversation. I hope to come on again soon.
All right. We're going to go ahead and take a break. Speaking of elections, we're going to be joined by the Elections and Boundaries Department. But we're going to be talking about the last call for re-registration coming up after the break, so stay tuned.